Do you really know what you're capable of? Are you good at taking on seemingly impossible challenges and just plodding away at them, undeterred? Well, the limits of human capacity are exactly what I want to explore in this podcast series coming up, and I have interviewed some of the world's most incredible humans who have done some crazy things. And today, I'm delighted to kick off with Jim Mann. He holds some of the records for the world's most difficult races, and many of these records are still standing, as well as he's also won the Dragon's Back, which is a 6-day race across practically every mountain in Wales. Just a lot of crazy things that if you're not into running, you won't know, so I'm not going to list them all right now. And when he isn't smashing the concepts of human endurance, he runs a major reforesting company called Future Forrest Company and a second business called Undo, which is focused on the concept of carbon removal. Their goal is to remove 1 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere by 2030 using their scalable technology of a carbon locking soil enhancer that not only improves soil health but reduces ocean acidification as well. So he really does take on the most massive challenges, and what I love about Jim is how understated he is. I mean, I honestly talk to some people that really jazz up what they're doing and they can't tell you how incredible they are. And yet Jim is really the opposite of that. He just sort of, I wouldn't say monotone exactly, but he really does just sound like a bloke who is doing some stuff. It happens to be some of the most incredible stuff in the world, but it is just some stuff and he just does it pragmatically. But when you listen to his actual words, he gets straight to the heart of the most profound things that you can do as a human. And so not only is this podcast a lesson on defying the limits of human endurance and tackling the largest problems that face humanity, it's also just a lesson on how to sit down and pragmatically do the work. And without further ado, I bring to you the brilliant yet understated and highly pragmatic Jim Mann. Hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Podcast. Today, I'm interviewing Jim Mann, who is the founder of the Future Forest Company, which runs ecological restoration, and Undo, who are focusing on carbon removals to stabilize the planet and basically helps mitigate climate change. And also is a pretty epic ultra marathon runner. And I saw some of his timings and was like, oh my God, I have no idea how he did these things. There's quite a long list of stuff that you've done there, winning Dragon's Back in 2015, UTMB, various other records, which you just seem to have done a lot of really big things, which seems very appropriate for coming on a podcast all about mindsets. So welcome to the show. If you could describe what made you start out doing these things.
I tend to get pretty involved in whatever I'm doing and commit fully to it. So once you start doing ultramarathons, it becomes a case of how fast can you do them and what's the next challenge, and trying to, I guess, push the boundaries as far as I could. I've always enjoyed competing. So racing things like Dragon's Back and UTMB and events like that. I enjoyed that competition as well. In terms of the planet, that feels somewhat different in that it's an existential threat to our way of life. And I think that it's a very large problem that I feel very driven towards trying to be a part of the solution.
So I find running is actually a good escape for me for recharging and being creative and stuff. Do you think that as an activity, it's just been helpful for you? Or do you do other things?
So typically I run every day. That's my main release. That's my my escape. I work a lot of hours, and so the running is my release. I love getting out onto the fells or into the hills on an evening, and I don't mind what that is. That can be with a head torch. If need be, I'll have the ice axe and crampons out in winter just in case you hit some rough bits. But yeah, just getting that in the hills is where I find my sort of happy place and I recharge.
I feel like sometimes it's a bit like therapy. Before you'd started the Future Forest Company, did you feel like you found any inspiration in running, or was it just completely unrelated and you were just like running a lot and you're also thinking about what to do with your life and happened to start going down that path?
The running's been quite important, and yeah, I can relate to your point on therapy. I need it to keep me balanced. But in terms of inspiration, I did a degree in ecology, so I've been aware of the climate. I felt I just had to work on it and had to be doing something because governments weren't moving quick enough, and just generally we aren't doing enough as a society to tackle that. So I felt I had to get involved and use the skills I had the best way I could.
So what had you been doing in between climate and your degree?
Yeah, I started my first business partway through university, and then I've always been a founder of businesses, so always startup businesses, real world leisure businesses, then online e-commerce, internet, mobile app development, a whole range of things over the years. So it was that gave me the freedom ultimately to work full time on climate. I think the reason climate came into focus for me was I'd been aware of it, I'd watched it, but it's such a big problem. I certainly thought it was a government's responsibility to fix. And I think a lot of people think that it's not something that they can necessarily do much about as an individual. And we know a lot about how the oil and gas companies transfer that responsibility onto us as individuals. And yet we're not very well empowered to do a huge amount. I got to a point where I felt like this actually is something I just have to be doing. I'm not living true to my values if I'm not working on this, even if I'm only a small piece of the solution.
But hopefully it can be a pretty important piece going forwards.
We've ended up in a position, that's why we've sort of separated Future Forrest and Undo, is Undo actually has a potentially a very significant part to play in that solution at a global level and could be able to remove gigatons of CO2. So none of us are going to solve climate change alone, but it could be a really significant part of the solution.
Did you think when you first started that you were aware that you might even be able to do something of that potential scale? Or was it just you wanted to start doing something and then ended up coming across these sort of bigger things?
Yeah, I think there's an entrepreneurial mindset thing where you think about scale. You're always sort of assessing, can this be scaled up? And I didn't know how we would scale up reforestation, but I hoped that we could form models and be able to scale it. There were barriers to that. So we kind of stumbled across enhanced rock weathering and then realized that that was far more scalable. And that's why my focus is there, because ultimately I'm an impact founder. So I want to have as much impact as possible. And that's why we've just hired somebody to replace me in Future Forest company. And I'm transitioning across full time to Undo, because that's where I can deliver the most impact and the most benefit in tackling climate change. So you do think about scale, but I wasn't setting out to be where we are today. It wasn't some great master plan that we would find something that could scale and could have a global impact. That wasn't the case. It was more about wanting to align with my personal values, but also be able to work on something that mattered and could have an impact and perhaps that other people could take the model from, rather than thinking we could scale something to have a global impact.
Yeah, sure. Do you feel like when you started running, you kind of just wanted to do well, but it also turned out that you were able to kind of break records?
Running is an interesting journey for me. So I was never great at running. I ran at school, I was competitive, and over years of hard work, I became quite good. But I had to work really hard at it. It's one of those things that I found that I wanted to work hard at. And there's a lot of things at school, things that either came quite easily to me or were really hard. So I'm dyslexic, which I don't use that as an excuse. I don't make a fuss about it. But it means that certain things I wasn't very good at and I hadn't been diagnosed. So I just wasn't very good at languages. I couldn't get spelling and grammar marks in any essays. You know, I'd automatically lose the percentages related to those. So I kind of just wasn't that interested in subjects I was bad at. The subjects I was good at, it was easy and I didn't have to try. Running was different. Running, I was average, but really wanted to be good at, and so worked really hard at. And I think it's something there that's created this undercurrent in my life, because it's something that I can do well at. I'm not especially talented, but by working hard, like really hard, far harder than my peers, I can get to a decent level. There's a different type of satisfaction when something's difficult and you achieve than something that's easy and you achieve.
Yeah, definitely. I relate to a lot of that. I also was dyslexic and found the whole like English and anything with lots of writing difficult, but then physics and maths, so I was just like, oh, this just makes sense. And didn't have to work so hard at that. But then I wasn't a good runner, but I've just enjoyed the process of getting better at it.
Running does reward, certainly long distance running, there's no the shortcuts, so it rewards you for the effort you put in. Not everybody equally, but certainly if you're prepared to put a lot of work in, you will get to a reasonable level.
Yeah, I think most people have a body that is born with an ability to run. If you just keep running, and it's mostly just doing a lot of miles and going out there, which can take a while.
Consistency and progression.
So in terms of your progression as a founder, do you find that that's sort of been similar to running in terms of the more times you've been starting businesses, you've been getting better? Or has it been a bit more erratic of some things go well, some things not?
I've had some successes and some failures, and I've learned more from the failures, but it's not a dissimilar journey. There's areas where if you keep working hard, you will progress. You do get better as you learn new skills and as you focus on those skills. But you also need to be thinking about what it is you're trying to do. And I certainly wasn't thinking about hugely scalable models and how do you scale this and how do you create a scalable model, which I think is slightly different. And so I think it's fair to say I've had some successes and learned the raw business skills, but then it's another set of skills you need to learn if you want to produce something that can scale rapidly. And that's taken me a bit longer.
Yeah, I align with that. As in, I think my first business went quite well. Didn't learn that much from it until I had some businesses that didn't go so well and realized why the first one worked. And that I wasn't as clever as I thought I was. But then trying to do things that like have much more potential for scale, I'm like, oh, some of this stuff's quite difficult. It is really interesting. And certainly some things like just maybe don't come quite so natural, like being a manager or hiring and things and understanding people is, I feel, is a bit of a like doing miles and seeing where things go wrong the more you do them and how to always do it in a better way and seeking the right sort of advice. What do you think was the most useful lesson that you learned through a mistake from business?
You make so many mistakes, and I think part of the thing you learn is not to beat yourself up about mistakes, to reflect on them and to try and learn from them. It's easy to beat yourself up in a bad way about them. I think some of the learnings are around advice and to really think very carefully about advice that you're getting, because you will get lots of conflicting advice, and it's easy to take that and almost absolve yourself of the responsibility. And ultimately, I think the biggest lesson is you should do what you believe and you should own that. And I haven't always done that. And I think I do that now. If I think something's right, I let people challenge it. I take on the advice and I think carefully when they don't agree with me. And they're some of the most painful things, to reflect on that advice that you don't think is right. Try and deeply understand why it's not right, or you don't believe it's right. Compartmentalize that and then move on and do what you believe is right. So I think for me, biggest lesson is when I've taken advice and not really owned the decision as a consequence. Now I try and own that decision, whether people around me agree with it or not, but very much through that lens of I listen to what they're saying, because sometimes I'm wrong.
Could you recount a specific example of advice and then decisions that you had to make and where you made a mistake or then learned from it?
I had a business where we had to choose a direction, more business to business focused or more business to consumer focused. And I was getting conflicting advice. And as a consequence, I had a view myself as to which one we should do, but I kept us doing both and tried to do both simultaneously. And that proved to be completely the wrong answer. Either of the other two answers could have been right, but trying to please everybody and take everybody's advice when it was conflicting was just a terrible decision. And what I should have done is gone, absolutely, we're going this way or we're going the other way, but we should never have been in that middle ground, pulled in all directions. And that's ultimately on me as a founder.
So how long did that decision then take or like impact you?
But ultimately, that business didn't succeed. I shut down that business. So either of the other two routes would have given us a better chance at success. And so it was effectively a terminal mistake for the business.
In terms of your other weaknesses, how have you find being dyslexic in terms of running a business? And what have you done to balance out your weaknesses there?
I try not to think about it too much, to be honest. I went right through university before I was diagnosed. I've got pretty good coping strategies. I tend to try and avoid doing the things I'm not good at, but that runs across everything. So dyslexia means you've got certain things you're really not very good at, and you need to get other people to do or to check or what have you. But I don't think there's any difference to any other weakness you might have as an individual. It's a case of if you're not the best person in the business to be doing it, then you should be trying to get somebody else to do it or to double check it or make sure it's right.
Yeah, I think just awareness of strengths and weaknesses. Have you thought much about your future role? Because you've already just said that you're now focusing on Undo and leading that business. But as it becomes a much bigger company and level of, I don't know, having an IPO or like being pretty giant to achieve the goals that you're looking for, like how your role would change and where you would fit in the company, like in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I think it's something that I'm very aware of because we've grown reasonably quickly. So across the two, we're 75 people now. So we've gone from first hire in early 2020 to 75 people now. So it feels like my role has changed. You know, almost every month you feel like your role's changed. No sooner have you kind of got to terms with whatever your new latest task that you have to master is, then you're passing it on to somebody else. So it's really weird. And I don't like to think too far ahead with that now, but I'm constantly looking a bit ahead and thinking, what am I going to have to be doing over the next 3 months? And where am I deficient for doing that? And how do I tool up quickly to do that? Is it that I need more support in certain areas? Is it that I need to skill up in certain areas? What things do I need to learn and master very, very quickly? And I think as long as we're growing, that's not going to change. There's an acceptance there now that this is a journey I want to be on. It's great fun. It's exciting. It's really hard. But at the same time, there's a lot of satisfaction from it. And therefore, I've got to just keep working out what I need to tool up on and doing it fast.
Something I kind of am aware of is that when I am doing things for the first time, I do make a lot of mistakes. And I like to pride myself on not making the same mistake twice too often. But as the company gets bigger and bigger, the gravity of said mistakes could be worse, maybe. How do you think about dealing with that?
I guess there's areas where you could make bad mistakes, but you've also got more people around you and mistakes are often diluted. You've also got more experience around you from different sectors. If you're listening and taking that on board, I find that it's almost, in some ways it's easier because there's often people that have already come across things that you're dealing with. So there's kind of a playbook, and it's just that, you know, I might not have that playbook or have been exposed to that playbook, but somebody else in the team or somebody else in my network will have been exposed to that. So in most cases, we're not doing anything new. We're not doing anything different. We're coming up against challenges other founders have come up against and we'll have found a solution for. So go get the help. I think one of the key things is to not have too much pride and be prepared to just say, hey, I don't really know what I'm doing here. Can you help me out? You know, how should I be doing this? What should I be thinking about? Yeah. Where might I get this wrong? And I think that's something that I probably wouldn't have done so well a few years ago. And now it tends to be my default is who's the best person I know to help me with this problem? Who's experienced it before?
How do you feel about mental health? Because you've mentioned that you're sort of obsessive and go very much down one area. And did you get burnout before with your other companies? And do you worry about the general mental health for yourself and also your employees in terms of, I think one of the problems with the world and solving climate change is that it can feel very overwhelming, like what you're doing maybe isn't going to be good enough.
Personally, I worry less. I will burn myself out. I know I will burn myself out if I let myself. So having done that a few times, I hope I've become more mindful of that and take a little bit more care of myself. I certainly recognize the signs of overwork, and there's times when as a founder you are going to probably have to go fairly deep and accept that you're probably working harder than you really ought to be. And it's just knowing where that limit's it and knowing when you really have to back off and hopefully getting the support you need. I definitely think about it for the team because of the experiences I've had. And I think you're in a different space as a founder. As a founder, you have a very deep commitment to what you're trying to do, particularly something like climate. So I'm aware that some of my team have a deep commitment to climate as well, or quite a lot of my team. We've filtered for it, but I'm aware that they perhaps haven't come up against those limits before and don't know where those limits sit. So we try and be as supportive as we can mental health wise. And it can be difficult because you're trying to move very quickly as an organisation. So there is pressure on people. It's recognizing when that pressure's hopefully becoming too much and you can intervene. And we do try and put some good support. And the other bit you asked about was climate, and climate being such a big challenge that it gets on top of you. And there's no doubt that's the case. And when you're very close to it, you're seeing changes in our climate that I don't think many people recognize how serious the situation we're in is. And so it can feel quite lonely as well. There is an acceptance, certainly for me, that I can't fix this. This is way beyond what I or Undo can do alone. So I think that helps lift some of the responsibility and gives me a framework to sort of say this is something we'll do as much as we possibly can. But at the end of the day, it's important that we also inspire other people to take other action. And we have a collective responsibility to tackle this. And it's such a big problem. It's not just going to be us. We can hopefully have a meaningful impact on it, but so can a lot of other people. And we'll need every tool in the toolkit to fix this. And we'll need everybody on the planet ultimately pushing in the same direction, I suspect, because I think it's going to get really grim before it starts to improve.
You've run a few different businesses, and the art of starting a good business is working out a problem that is specific and being able to solve it in a way that you can scale. When you first realized that you wanted to be working in climate change, how did you then go into huge giant area? How did you find the specific problem and sort of actually start building something that was scalable? I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that actually do want to run some form of climate business, but how would you actually figure out what to solve and make it happen?
I would say don't try and work out what's scalable. Try and fix something. Pick out the bit that interests you and just try and fix it. Particularly, look around, see who else is fixing that bit. And if no one is, then get stuck in. Don't worry about scale initially. It's a distraction. Until you have a real deep understanding of the problem that you're trying to fix, you probably don't know if it's a scalable opportunity. There's a point in time where you need to assess whether this is something scalable, if you want it to be scalable. And there's this Silicon Valley mindset that has filtered around the world that everything has to be scalable, everything has to be a VC business, everything has to be $1 billion company, or it's not worth starting. It's just not true. Just don't accept that. There's so many great lifestyle businesses, and for some people, they make a really good salary every year doing something they love doing. Well, a lot of people can be happy doing that, and I'm jealous of those people who aren't quite so obsessive. A lot of great businesses that just pay a good salary, and founders could be very happy doing them. And I guess then there's another type of business that is scalable to a certain point, but isn't going to be a really big company and can be grown organically. So I think that's another significant opportunity, and we shouldn't be obsessed with businesses that can be $1 billion companies. We should be focused on lots of different solutions that might scale in different ways. It might be repeatable by lots of different people, for example, but not a scalable business in itself.
Could you describe your journey in starting Future Forest company and Undo in terms of just trying to fix a specific problem before getting into the grand scaling side of it?
The North Star that we were focusing on was climate change. And the ecological background took me to Future Forest and tree planting, because you get carbon drawdown plus you get biodiversity benefits. So it's kind of like this, great holistic solution, which I find very exciting. But ultimately, the scalability of it is flawed to some extent. There are places where we should be doing lots of reforestation, and Future Forest Company continues to do that. When I was looking towards enhanced shock weathering, it was because I wanted something that we could co-deploy to increase the benefit that we were doing. And the idea was to put the two together and increase benefit. Over time, it became apparent that we could do that better by separating the two strands, because one was growing quicker, had a different culture. There were lots of reasons why the two didn't actually fit as well together as it looked like they should do initially. And that's what led to separating the two. But it's always been the same focus. The focus was always climate change and maximizing the impact on climate change. And that's just drawn me to Undo, because we can scale it quicker and it can have much bigger impact on a global scene.
How did you find out about the specific solutions? Were you just reading a lot of science, or where did the idea for the enhanced weathering and that kind of area come from?
Yeah, I think I spent a lot of time reading papers, digging quite deep on potential solutions. A lot of them I felt were red herrings or things that were unacceptable to society. and enhanced rock weathering really felt like it actually ticked all the boxes. It was a benefit to agriculture, so it reduces agricultural inputs, which releases CO2, things like lime production. So you get a reduction benefit as well as an actual carbon removal. And it was apparent to me when I first started looking at this a couple of years ago that we were going to have to actually draw CO2 back out of the atmosphere. The reporting in papers is often lagging behind where we really are on this climate journey, if you like, and things keep getting worse because we aren't acting as quickly. And it's only in the last few months that the IPCC have recognised that we have to actually draw down CO2 as well that we've already put in the atmosphere. It's a case of we need to find ways that can scale to do that, and we simply don't have enough of them. And all of the IPCC predictions are based on us having some level of carbon removal. Well, we need to be scaling that up now and understanding how to scale that up. Otherwise, we just won't have the tools we need when we hit the point that we need to be deploying them at scale. And ideally, start deploying them at scale today, but there is a tension with reduction versus removal. And there's a very strong argument we should be reducing our emissions first because it's much easier than removing CO2. But we're going to need both. So we've got to basically get up to speed on both and have a playbook for both.
What was it you think that made you realize how big the problem was in terms of geopolitics and the effect on the world that's going to be happening?
So I knew at university that we'd got a problem brewing here, but it was something that governments should have been solving. We've known for long enough, and it's big forces at play that should be fixing it. So I knew there was going to be a problem, and as I've watched in kind of disbelief over 20 years of inaction, you start thinking this is going to get really bad. And I don't think there's any one point where I've just had that light bulb, we've got to act on this. I've always known we'd have to act on it, but had we acted 20 years ago, the problem would be much easier to tackle. So I think we've put ourselves in a really difficult situation now. And I just happened to get to a point in my career or my life where I had the opportunity to work on it full time and carved out the opportunity to work on it full time. So it's more a personal thing of being able to do that than there was a light bulb when I started working on it. I just had the financial freedom to invest my time into something else. And then hopefully, as other people do that, we can get to scale the solutions we need.
What do you think you're most worried about currently in terms of climate change?
I think if we don't act, then the big problem is going to be food. So we're already seeing simultaneous crop failures across the planet. And that ultimately will lead to instability in societies, which might well lead to war and to mass migration. So the missing link in this is that people think about climate change and the direct impacts, the impact of flooding, of extreme weather. And that's still how we generally connect climate change to society. But in actual fact, it's this far less recognized threat is actually to our food systems. And if our food systems collapse, then our society is threatened, and that's the biggest danger. I fear that crop failures will lead to societal breakdown. And one of the things that I link that back to is I have 2 young children, and there's nothing worse than when they're hungry and you haven't got something to feed them. And it really is painful. And I'm talking about being out on a walk with them and they're hungry and need feeding and they start to melt down. To not be able to fix that, to not be able to get them home and give them some food, to just not have food for them, is terrifying. It must be so painful as a parent to be unable to even provide food for a child. And that's one of the things that really crystallizes that danger and that threat.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked. In terms of more of your grander thoughts on mindsets, what's been one of your most useful principles that you think you've learned?
I think that I'm an optimist in most situations. So having an optimistic outlook on life is really powerful. I don't think I'd be doing what I do now if I wasn't optimistic. Obviously, a common entrepreneurial trait, but I think so much of the stuff that we're doing and that we're working on, and you see other changes, things like electric cars, that seemed impossible even a decade ago and is now destroying the internal combustion engine market and being legislated for. And we're getting cleaner air, we're getting better transportation, they're better to drive. There's no negatives to an electric car versus a petrol car today other than some of the issues around mining of the chemicals. But also if you're watching the battery tech, that's being solved elsewhere. So I have this very optimistic outlook that actually we have the tools, we have the ability to tackle this. And if we can bring the political will behind it and a mass movement of people, and we need to lead the politicians. Politicians are followers, not leaders. And this is something that people, I think, often miss. It's up to us to tell the politicians with our votes and with our actions what we're going to support and what we're not going to support, and that they need to be following the will of the people, which is what they should be doing. So we need to give them clear messages on that. But I'm actually optimistic that we're going to have a bumpy time, I think, but at the other end of it, we will have a better society and a better world where we'll have cleaner air, we'll have better transportation, we'll have just a nicer place for all of us to live and exist and coexist. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think it's good to stay optimistic.
Would you say that also comes up a lot in the ultramarathons? Have you had like a lot of dark moments when you're doing really long runs?
Yeah, definitely. I don't always get through them. I'm there to compete often. And if it's not going well, I'll always finish. If I'm not enjoying it, I won't always finish. On good days where, I have my best runs, that just doesn't even get into you. Doesn't even exist. It can be amazing when everything clicks. It's really special. And I know this will sound weird to people, but to go 24 hours through mountains, even in bad conditions, and not even really be conscious of what you're doing in some ways, just being in that flow type state, it's amazing. It's something really special. So yeah, you've got to be well prepared. You've got to be in good condition. You've got to have everything right. But then when you've got the right mind frame, those things can just be pure joy from start to end.
It's definitely an important one around like not forcing it if it isn't working. Because I learned that by mistake in terms of, I had like some pretty major leg issues, but carried on. Turns out I'd fractured my leg and ran almost a marathon with a broken leg, which is super dumb. And they couldn't walk for ages. And could have just waited.
Not a good look.
Not at all. Yeah, right now all day was this other thing. Like, actually, it's great to be able to persevere, but sometimes it's really stupid and you shouldn't do it. I'm like, that was me being an idiot. Good. Oh dear.
So learning point.
Yeah. Which in hindsight seems super obvious, but when you're like excited, you're like, oh yeah, must finish.
But there are other times where I have pushed through things that I really wasn't enjoying, and they can be very satisfying experiences as well.
Yeah. Sometimes, like when I trust my gut, it's good. Sometimes my gut is like, absolutely don't ever do this. And then when I do it, and it's like the best thing ever. And it's really hard to know. Like, it's not fully intuitive.
I've definitely got experiences that I can put either side of that and say that they were right or wrong, and you just never know.
What would you say was one of like the scariest things that you've done where your gut was like, Jim, what the hell are you doing? Please stop doing this. But you actually did complete it.
I've definitely had some scary bits on winter rounds, which were beyond my comfort zone. I did a round in the Scottish mountains a few years ago in January. And I remember climbing steep snow slopes with ice axes that were beyond my comfort. But I had some really good people with me. And I remember sort of thinking, what if this goes wrong? I'll look really silly, but, people could get hurt, and it'd be hard to justify what we were doing at night, going across a knife edge ridge in snow with ice on the ground. But I look back now on it, I'm glad we did it. It worked out fine, and it's a very good memory. But I think sometimes you don't really know where that boundary of what's sensible and what's safe really fits, and you trust the people around you, and they're more experienced than me. They carried me through what was a nervous experience to some extent, but we got through it fine, and they never flinched. So sometimes it's one person's comfort zone where the risk is very different to another's.
Oh, 100%. Can be super different. Although you don't know what's actually going through their mind. Maybe they're just sort of like super wet, like, oh God. But just holding it together really well. Cool. A few final things. What's one of your earliest ever memories?
I remember some tomato plants from when I must have been 3 or 4, and I remember a row of tomato plants outside of the house that I was born at up in Edinburgh, and they stick in my mind. And I remember my mum's always, when I talked about it with her, she's surprised that I remember that, but I can tell where they were. So that's probably my earliest memory.
That's so random, but interesting.
It is, isn't it? It is. It's weird.
Nice. Maybe develop your early love of tomatoes. Who knows? And what's one of the kindest things someone has done for you?
I think it's often the little acts of kindness that sort of really just make a point of things. So I did a trip a few years ago, and I don't really come across the Mongol Rally, but I took a 1960s Morris Minor from London across to Ulaanbaatar, and this thing just kept breaking down. And this kind of random acts of kindness on that trip were amazing, where someone would come and help you. Someone who didn't have common language with would help you repair something on the car because they saw you broken down in the desert. Little things like that tend to stick with me. A recent example, I had whenever I'm in the US, I seem to have problems with credit cards. Sometimes credit cards just won't work. And just someone who paid for a tube ticket because they saw me struggling with it. Things like that can lift your day and inspire you, and hopefully it certainly makes me try and do those little things for other people, because I know how they can lift my day. And sometimes you don't need it lifting, but sometimes it really just restores your faith in humanity, I guess. So I think they're the most important things, the small things, not the big things. Tend to be people that you know. And I don't think that's quite as inspiring as the little things from people that you perhaps don't know and will never see again, and they didn't have to do. If they'd just walked on by, you'd have thought it was perfectly normal.
But it can really make a difference to your day, and who knows if they've made a difference to your day, that you maybe go and impact a bunch of other people, or especially if you're feeling down. And yeah, butterfly effects can be big, so do nice stuff.
Yeah, it makes you sort of think, you see somebody who's struggling with a ticket machine at the international airport, it's always painful. And if you just can spend a few minutes helping somebody with that, it makes a huge, huge difference. And I think it says more about a culture when people try and do things like that than some of the bigger gestures.
Well, thanks so much to Jim for taking the time out from his busy day saving the world to talk to us. And I just love how straight up he is and to the point and undistractable. Like, oh, I need to do this thing. I guess I'll do it. Oh, it's really, really, really hard. Well, I'll do it anyway, and it might take some more time. Like, he's just a machine. I wish I was more like him. And on that note, have a great day, week, life, and keep growing.